Hello everyone, Alistair Gold of Football.London here from Hotspur Way. We've just had Mauricio Pochettino's press conference. It was a very long press conference, a bit of an epic really. Had a bit of everything, injury news, strong views on Twitter trolls, players and whether they're going to play, whether they're not going to play. There was a lot in there, including a little rant halfway through as well, which we'll get to. But let's start with the injury news. Big one really. Tanguy Ndombele is out. Picked up a minor knock in training this week, so he's going to miss the game. Not sure if he's going to be back for the North London derby at this point. Dele Alli, however, is back. He's been training this week, and they're going to make a decision on him tomorrow after the final training session to see whether he can be involved against Newcastle. Obviously, in terms of players back from suspension, Heung-min is back. Sonny is back in the squad, and I get the impression, the way that Pochettino was talking about him, he was making a real kind of case of how, yes, he's been suspended for these two matches, but actually they use that as a positive. Because let's not forget, Sonny had an absolute kind of mess of a season last year in terms of Asian Games, Asian Cup, World Cup. He was absolutely everywhere playing. So this was a kind of a chance for them to give him a proper pre-season, work on his fitness and work on various aspects of his game that they want to improve on. And Pochettino says, in his words, the whole plan was to get him into an absolutely perfect state for when it was the time for him to play again. That kind of leads me to think that maybe we might see him start, which I didn't kind of think earlier in the week. I would have thought it might be a little bit too much, maybe slightly unfair on Lucas and Lamella, who obviously both scored at the weekend. But the way he was talking, I think Son might come back into that team. We shall see on Sunday. In terms of fitness of other players, I know a lot of people have been calling for Giovanni Lo Celso to start. I don't think that's going to be the case, and I don't think it's going to be the case for a little while either. In Pochettino's own words, he said he's still so far from where we want him to be, and that's not the player's fault. It's because he was away at the Copa America in the summer. They had the third place match, which I think was July the 6th, so he's literally came back so late to pre-season at Real Betis. And then Pochettino said in the week of the transfer itself, he actually wasn't training for pretty much that whole week. So all he's had at Tottenham has been these 2 weeks or so of training. So in his own words, they're going to be patient, they're going to take their time with him, and he's just not quite there yet. So anyone excited about seeing the young Argentine kind of getting starts, it's unlikely. Going to get, it sounds like, substitute minutes here and there as they build up his fitness and also the demands of what Pochettino wants from him. I think obviously we've got the League Cup coming up. I do wonder whether that might be one where we see him get his first start possibly as well. I think that's next month, isn't it? Obviously, the transfer window itself came up because various players linked with the exit door at Tottenham Hotspur. Obviously, George's Kevin Nkudu's gone. I asked him about him, asked the boss and what he thought about why it didn't really work for the Frenchman. And he said, to be honest, it's just the way it is. Sometimes these players at every club, it just doesn't quite click for him, doesn't happen. And GK was one of these people, just never really fit. On a personal opinion, this is me, not Pochettino, I just felt Spurs in their scouting maybe were slightly wrong in this one. They went for a guy that was very much a traditional winger, sticks out left, the old cliche, getting chalk in their boots, touchline paint on them, and Pochettino's attacking midfielders don't do that. They're versatile, they can play through the centre, they can play on the opposite side of the pitch, they can be strikers as well. And Nkudu, while he showed a couple of little bright moments, obviously the assist against Fulham was a massive one, he just never really gave enough. And every comment you got from Pochettino during his time at the club, it's sensed that he wanted more. He wanted more from him in training, more consistency. And we know Pochettino's a really big stickler on, if you do it in training, that's when you're going to get into his team. And so Nkudu has gone. He is at Besiktas in a deal that is around just under £5 million. And there's talk from Turkey that Spurs have whacked in a massive 50% sell-on clause, which, if he can get his career back on track, could be lucrative for them down the line. But Pochettino, we've heard him spoke about it before, and he said it again today. He's just not happy about this foreign transfer window being open later than the English one. For him, in his own words, he said it's a mess. Obviously, the club are sitting there not sure what's going to happen with certain players. They can't focus fully on the season ahead because they don't know who's going to be there. So they're having to coach and play with contingency plans. For Pochettino, he's probably thinking, I've got to think down the line of, say, Eriksen goes or say Wanyama goes, who is there? Who are the players that come in? How do I fill those gaps? Is the squad big enough? Are there young players that come through? It's a lot to juggle when really everything should be closed at the same time. It doesn't really make much sense. On Wanyama, he was a bit non-committal, didn't really go into whether the Kenyan is going to go. From what I've heard, Club Brugge are close to doing a deal with Spurs for him. I think it's around 13.5 million all in. That's including add-ons for the future as well. But it's very much of the case of the player now who has to decide on whether he wants to go there, if the terms are right. Club Brugge have got a Champions League second leg qualifier next week. They're 1-0 up, I believe, against an Austrian team, Lask. And obviously, if they get into the Champions League, that's a big £20 million boost to their kind of coffers as well, and what they can offer Wanyama. And obviously, the fact that Wanyama would be playing in the Champions League. So I wouldn't be surprised if we don't really see much in the way of developments on that until that second leg, which is next Wednesday, I believe. It'd be interesting to see. It's a fall from grace in a way for Wanyama, but for a guy that he's a terrific player, really good player. He certainly wasn't that first season with Dembele, but ultimately, I think it's 11 starts in the Premier League in the last 2 years. These knee issues have just been such a problem for him. He just hasn't been able to get a run of games, and we're talking about both knees as well. He's had problems with, not just the one. So for him, it's a case of maybe that's the options he has now. It's a profit. Spurs will make a profit. I think they bought him for about 9 million from Southampton back in 2016. But for him, it's a step down, and it's an indication that other teams weren't willing to pay that for the player. And at 28, you'd still think he's got good years ahead of him. So hopefully he does, but we'll see what happens on that. One other point that Pochettino said when he was asked about Wanyama, he tried to stress it wasn't about Wanyama, but he kind of felt it was, as well as other players. He said Tottenham Hotspur are not a charity. They're not here to, give players who played very well in the past game time. They're, in his own words, it's about today, not yesterday. Wanyama was a great player for him, in that first year with Dembele in 2016-17. And you kind of felt maybe he was talking about other players, the likes of Vertonghen, who obviously there's outcry at the moment that he's not in the team. If Vertonghen was fantastic last season, maybe this summer he hasn't quite been doing the business in terms of fitness and the pre-season. Maybe he just wasn't that impressed with him, and he's got to work his way to get back into the team like anyone else. I suppose it's a good way of doing it. It's what you want, isn't it? It's what the players want. You want to be able to earn your spot in the team in a fair way and not based on reputation. So we're going to see. It'd be interesting to see. Vertonghen, he was actually quite clear. Someone asked him about him, and he said, I feel there's a better player to play in there. And obviously we're talking about Davinson Sanchez. So all eyes on this week and whether Vertonghen comes straight back in, because sometimes Poch does say stuff like that and you get a sudden change of heart. He had this little rant in the middle. There were a couple of questions. He started with the Vertonghen one, and then he went off on one again in the next one because he was asked about, against Newcastle, might he experiment with the Argentina, with the Arsenal match in mind coming up next week? He didn't like that, it's safe to say. He started a bit of a rant about, experimenting. That's for scientists and chemists. That's not something we do as football coaches. We're only 3 games into a season. That's just not how football works. He wasn't delighted about that. I tried to ask about Mike Dean. Obviously, Mike Dean's the referee on Sunday. I don't believe that Mike Dean has refereed a Spurs game since that Burnley match. Obviously, we know what happened after that. The clash with Pochettino at the end, the FA charge for Pochettino where he got the suspension. And I asked him, had he spoken to Mike Dean since then? And he was little bit of a kind of a smile on the corner of his lips. And he said, the rules are the rules. I am not allowed to talk about referees before or after matches. I'm not entirely sure that's the complete rule, but I think in terms of him not getting himself landed with another charge or a fine, that's probably is a good idea. So I had to stop that pretty quickly. And then I asked him about other stuff about, for me, he's a coach that works on the training ground, loves working with young players, and I just feel this kind of the influx now of Ndombele, Celso, Sessegnon, the younger players as well, like Troy Parrott, players like that. Does it excite him? Does it spark him back into life in terms this season with new people to work with? And he kind of indicated that is a side he loves, but also he made it very clear that we mustn't get too carried away with these players because they are very young players. I think he's kind of trying to look at other teams that spent big money on big players. Spurs have spent big money, in some cases, on players who are still young and still got a lot to learn and improve on. And he said, and that's quite a big responsibility for him. He knows he has to kind of develop these players and also be competitive at the same time. And he mentioned Jack Clarke as well. Jack Clarke obviously struggling at Leeds to get in at the moment because they've got 6 loan players and you're only allowed 5 in matchday squads. I do know Tottenham Hotspur do have a recall clause for Jack Clarke. They can bring him back in January if they feel it's not going well. But I also noticed today that Marcelo Bielsa has been speaking about Jack Clarke and said he will get opportunities this season. He'll play plenty, I think was the expression he used. I think it's just a case of the player at the moment just finding his fitness and getting into his team. But I think that situation will be resolved probably in a way that he stays at Leeds and gets game time. But like I say, if it comes to January and that's not the case, there is this option for Tottenham Hotspur to bring him back. Other than that, mainly it spoke about Newcastle briefly. Obviously, there's so many other subjects, weirdly. Newcastle being the team Tottenham are going to play, that actually wasn't the most pressing kind of question in there. But he did speak about Newcastle and Steve Bruce and said it's really difficult and harsh to judge Steve Bruce on just 2 matches in. He's been getting a bit of flack, the new Newcastle boss, because obviously not a very popular appointment with the fans. But Pochettino said it's just so early in the season. There's a lot to go, a lot of teams to play, a lot of players to come in and out of teams, and it would be really harsh to kind of judge Steve Bruce that early. But he did say he's expecting to win. This is Pochettino. You know, he was very clear that I'm expecting to win. He expects his team to beat a struggling Newcastle team and extend this unbeaten run, and hopefully they will. That's your kind of roundup on today's press conference. There's more to come. Little bits and pieces from different sections of the press conference, which you will find out over the next couple of days, and hopefully Tottenham can do what Pochettino expects and bring back a victory from the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium on Sunday. I'll catch you there then.